Hi everybody, welcome to our Dataprise Academy webinar uncovering the common pitfalls in your 2017 IT budget. My name is Sadie Coppell. I'm the marketing coordinator here at Dataprise, moderating today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we're ready to get started. This session will be hosted by Ryan Miller, Dataprise's Senior Manager of Strategic Consulting. Originally from Australia, Ryan Miller joined the Dataprise team in early 2016 to lead the Strategic Consulting Department. Mr. Miller has an extensive career in providing outsourced IT and strategic consulting services over the last 20 years, where he has worked with mid-market and enterprise customers across several industry sectors, including Australian state and federal governments, energy, oil and gas, mining, financial services, and education. Ryan holds a Master of Business Administration from the University of Western Australia, and I will hand it over to Ryan.
Okay, thank you very much, Sadie. Welcome everybody to the webinar. As Sadie pointed out there, I lead the strategic consulting practice here at Dataprise. All of the information that you can see up on the webinar here, and I do apologize for my accent. So if you have any questions going through, put them through into your chat window. If you've got any questions, we'll be running some polls through this webinar as well. So I'll prompt you when those polls are going to come up, and we'll get started right now. So what we're going to do on this webinar is we're going to run through a couple of different agenda items. One will be budget basics. I'm not going to delve too deeply into this, but it'll give you just a rough overview of some of the things to consider when preparing your budget. I'll then look at some of the current trends, and we'll highlight some of the research and what we're seeing that's happening out in the marketplace in terms of IT spend and where companies are putting their money in their budgets. And then we'll talk about some of the pitfalls, so some of the things to consider when putting a budget together, some of those hidden costs, some of those things that sometimes get overlooked. I want this to be as interactive and open a session as possible, so if you do have questions that come up, we may either address those as they come up, or we may address them at the end, depending on the relevance to the slide and how much time you've got going on. So without further ado, we'll get started. So when we talk about a budgeting process, and this is the process of assembling a budget, not the budget life cycle, which we'll go into a little bit later, but there are three basic stages. One, we gather the requirements. Two, we create a proposal, and I'll tell you why we call it a proposal shortly, and then we finalize the budget. So when we look at gathering the requirements, there are two basic things that we need to do in terms of what we analyze. We look at what our current costs are, so what we do, that's like a historical look, looking back, what our expenses to date have been and where we look towards our year-end forecasts, and any pricing changes that we may expect from vendors who will give us pricing change notifications. The second element that we look at is the going forward part, so determine what's happening within your environment and understanding that IT budget is integrated with your business's budget. So you'll probably hear me say this a few times through the webinar, is that we don't budget in a bubble. One of the biggest things we need to understand is that IT touches all elements of the business, and decisions that the business makes will have cost impacts upon your IT budget and vice versa. So when we're looking at going forward, when we look at things like volume changes, are we getting extra people into the organization? Are we adding extra sites? Have we acquired another company? Does that change the way in which that we need to address the volumes? Are we adding any activity? So are there new initiatives that we're going? Are we adding extra lines of business? Are we changing what we're doing in terms of the business function? And have we dropped any activity? So have we dropped any lines of business? Contingency is a big thing to look at. It's one of those things that you tend to eat into. So what contingencies do you need to put into place for these initiatives and volume changes? And of course, any cost increases that you expect coming through into your new budget period. Then once we've got our forward-looking and our backward-looking information, we put together a scope of our budget about what we're going to deliver. So what are the line items that sit within our budget? Any cost-saving opportunities that we've got, there's some analysis that we can maybe get some economies of scale. Changes to the current costs that we've identified, so we need to present those up, and then the cost of any projected changes. From that point, we then need to create our proposal. So This is, for want of a better word, it's a sales process. You're selling the budget back up into the business and executive. So you need to understand the constraints that sat in preparing your budget and justify with some effective rationale how you have come to those cost decisions. You then look at, we'll cover this off a little bit with the capital and operating expenditure and discretionary and non-discretionary spending, but make sure you split your budget out and show people what you have done, where and why you are spending the money there, and having a good justification cause. The next thing to understand with that is that some of the challenges that you will get will be not understanding what can and cannot slide out of the budget. So that's when you start to finalize your budget with the business. The business priorities with the business units and the different stakeholders within the organization will be able to tell you what projects are more important to the business and which aren't, what could slide out, costs need to be negotiated back into the budget. So there's a little bit of a back and forward to get a better indication to ensure that you can get what you need out of your budget. Again, like I said, you need to sell this up. So don't just send a spreadsheet out to the people. Prepare, hey, even a presentation, you sit down, walk them through the budget and justify everything. It'll make it a lot easier as you go on. And then, of course, we deal with the final approvals. So, the business ultimately will make decisions around projects and what gets up. You just need to then adjust your budget and then execute. It's a fairly standard process to get to this point. The negotiation and deal with final approvals may kind of back and forth a little bit, but if you're well prepared, you put yourself in a much better position to get the business to approve your budget. So earlier then I spoke about different expense categories, and most people will understand the difference between operating expenditure and capital expenditure, but we'll just go over those a little bit. Capital expense. So this is part of your organization's capital budget. Think about this as big ticket items, things that you would spend that you can physically touch, like a piece of infrastructure, anything that is going to be capitalized and could to some point be depreciated against your company's asset register. Operating expenses or operating expenditure, these are related to the operations running the business, or in this particular instance, running IT department. So what that will include things like subscriptions, any hosting that you may have, maintenance contracts, support contracts that you have with vendors, anything that's basically to keep your environment fed and watered. These are the costs that would be your operating expenditure. Project expenses, these are normally tied to discrete outcomes. So if you are standing up a new CRM, or you're putting in a new SharePoint environment, or if you're standing up a new line of business and there's an application to support that, that's what we would call project effort. Now, some of it may or may not be capitalized at the end of the project. So once it goes from project into production, it may be required or discretionary spending, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And they're often the more flexible part of the IT budget. So they're things that can slide in and slide out of your budget. And you'll hear me use words like delay or delete later on and then through this presentation. So you may be able to delay these items or delete them from your budget altogether. So the expensing decision, and this is when we talk about non-discretionary and discretionary spending. So essentially, non-discretionary spending is things that are essentially they're mandatory, they're non-negotiable, they're what you need to do to operate the environment. Discretionary spending are the things that can slide in and out. Think of non-discretionary spending as needs and discretionary spending as wants. Now, the business may want to run a few projects to deliver those out, but if push comes to shove, some of those things could be moved out of your budget, delayed, or deleted away. So the equation is very simple. It's non-discretionary activities plus your discretionary activities equal your approved budget. And the next tool or the next thing that you can do in terms of budgeting, so some of the budgeting basics, is you can use benchmarking. So looking at the ways other companies assemble their budgets in terms of percentages and their activities, and making that as a sanity check for your own budget. Now, there's words of warning when it comes to benchmarking. One, Every business is different, so the blend and the mix of what they spend on different things in these benchmarks may not be relevant to your organization. However, if you are going to use benchmarking again for that sanity check, make sure it's from a reliable source. I would suggest that you use a more of an industry relevant benchmark to take from your industry publications and something that's more relevant. The blend of spending in health versus retail versus finance sector is quite different, and you need to understand that these are again generalizations. So if you use them, just as a word of warning, your budget may look very different, and you need to just use it as a quick sanity check. The other thing is that if you don't have any historical data, a benchmark is a good place to start. Again, don't use it as a gospel, use it as a guide. So we're about to send out a poll for you guys. So if you could take some time to just respond to this poll, it'll give us a bit of an idea. So okay. All right, so we're getting some responses back now. So that's excellent. So I think it's good that if you think that you are prepared to have the right tools to budget, it's very important. So let's talk about some current trends that we're seeing. So there was some research performed by IBM in a survey, and they looked at budget spending from 2015 and looked to what people were looking to spend in 2016 and 17. And it was an interesting piece of research that showed that tech spending is actually quite mixed. Like 42% of businesses are actually not changing their IT budgets at all. So that, and by not changing their budget, that's within plus or minus 5%. So any sort of material change to their budget is either an increase or decrease. It's interesting that 46% of people are increasing their budgets and only 12% are decreasing. Again, the reasons for these in the research weren't as granular as what we would have liked, but we do understand that there is a penchant to lean forward in certainly this budget cycle. One of the outcomes that they found in the survey and research as well was that 81% of businesses are analysing their internal spend and deciding on whether to outsource some degree of their delivery. That may be to outsource their infrastructure or some of the services that are delivered or application delivery. So, essentially everyone's sort of reevaluating their internal delivery teams and making sure that they're getting the right outcome for the right dollar spend. Technology end of life is going to strongly influence 2017 budgets. A lot of decisions that were made 3 to 5 years ago in terms of technology spend and particularly in terms of virtualization and infrastructure are going to affect what the companies are going to invest in over the next sort of like this budget cycle, but for the next 3 to 5 years going forward as well. Where we segue into that conversation is it's mainly what people are talking about is moving from having their own infrastructure to moving to cloud or some kind of software or platform as a service, and moving that from a capital expenditure into operating expenditure, particularly in terms of utility computing. Being able to dial up and dial down that workload is a very good cost advantage for businesses if it's done right. Also, they're looking to move their licensing away from sort of the traditional purchasing model to a subscription service. So these are the trends that have come out in the survey. Then this next one is an interesting focus on COTS or commercial off-the-shelf applications. We found, and in the research and what we've looked at sort of over time, is that lean into open source as a cheap alternative going, at the initial outset is starting to haunt businesses coming down the line in terms of support effort, in terms of being able to have some kind of controlled cost around supporting or developing that application. And a lot of the application functionality that's available today that wasn't available when these applications were developed, say 10 years ago, is now starting to become freely available. So companies are looking to move those, particularly the in-house developed applications, away into some more supportable and structured commercial applications that are available to us today. One of the other trends, which is a little bit of a bad trend in my opinion, is the extension of physical asset life. So companies are trying to stretch their assets out and get more out of them. In particular, we're seeing this in the desktop and the laptop space, where people are, taking their life cycle of their desktop assets from 3 years to 4 years to 5 years and sometimes beyond. And aside from the risk that poses, there's a couple of also social factors that impact upon the business in terms of things like desktop envy and just the general feel about when a new employee comes in and they get a 5-year-old laptop. The risk on infrastructure is that sometimes taking something outside of its maintenance life or extending its asset life can put operation at risk. So you need to balance that cost saving between the risk if something were to go wrong and what the impact is on the business. BYD, and that is everything from mobility to bring your own everything. I could talk about this a lot. However, I'll put it down to there is a move and people are moving to BYD. It's just to understand that the cost reductions that you experience are sometimes a false economy. If you have people bringing their own laptops, you need to provide them some form of remote desktop service in order for them to work inside the corporate network. If they're connecting physically to the corporate network, then there's security elements that you need to look at. So while you may reduce your costs in one area in terms of asset spend, you may be increasing costs on the other end for service spend. So it's, again, there are cost savings, but they're born elsewhere in your budget. And the final trend that we're seeing is companies are spending a lot more and leaning forward into IT security. There's a lot in the news, particularly lately, in terms of cybersecurity attacks and people losing IT records, and we'll talk a little bit about that going forward towards the end of the webinar. But just there's a general lean into spending more money on IT security. So for everyone out there, I think we've got another poll coming up. And it's around how mature you think your IT budgeting is. So if you could just take some time to answer that poll, that'd be great. Okay, great. Thanks for answering that poll, everyone. So we've got some mixed answers there. So if anyone needs, I guess, extra information about that, we'll be sending some information out at the end of this webinar over sort of the next day or so, and we'll talk about some of the current pitfalls now coming through. So these are some of the things that we could possibly look at that may be hidden items in your budget. And we'll talk about those, and we'll set a poll up sort of like a little halfway through this as well to just try and get some of your feedback on this. So one of the common pitfalls that we find is around cloud costs, cloud migration, and cloud operations. So the interesting piece of information, again from the same survey that IBM did, was that 94% of organizations are at least discussing cloud options now, and that's in some form, so that they may be moving their infrastructure into the cloud, into Azure or AWS as an infrastructure as a service play. It may be Office 365. It may be moving some software as a service, so incorporating something like Salesforce into their organization. So there's a couple of, I think, things that got you, as well as apart from budgeting, that cloud's not a silver bullet. It doesn't fix everything. So making sure that you understand that the cost being provided by your cloud option, whatever that may be, the value offered is greater than the cost. And these normally come around flexibility, scalability, data security with data encryption at rest, and other items. So understanding that the cost benefit to move to the cloud is often much greater than the actual cost that you're delivering. However, you need to understand that the costs do not disappear, they shift. When you put something into the cloud, those costs don't evaporate with it. And generally, it'll be a move from a capital expenditure into an operating expenditure. So you'll be looking at, I now no longer have to buy the infrastructure, that cost has disappeared, but it's just moved, and it's moved over into a different bucket. There may be some cost, I guess, benefits that you get along the way, but in general, the rule is that those costs don't disappear. So it's like people say, well, why should I go to cloud? Well, there are other value adds that you get from moving into the cloud, but that cost base still stays the same. So it's a difference between cost and value. So one of the things to think about, or some of the things to think about, is when you're planning your cloud, you make some considerations around the cost base that it's going to take when you look at the operations. But in terms of migration, understanding some of those probably not so known factors, and that is that labor costs are approximately 50% of the migration cost. So understanding that, in as well as the impact to the business and then the changes and the setup cost for the provider, there's a labor cost as well that's there. And you want to try and control that cost as much as possible. One way to do that is to engage a vendor, get them to provide it as a fixed price project. That way any risk that you have now just transfers to them. If they encounter a problem while they're doing a migration, it's theirs to sort out. They've told you they can do that for a price. If you don't have the skill set internally, that's another way to do it, or the skills that you have internally you're not quite confident in, which sometimes can occur. If when something goes wrong and you reach that point of no return in your migration, you need to just get it fixed. So you need to understand what that will do, and that will also impact the third point on that. That's the migration downtime. Understanding that you're doing this outside of business hours, you need to understand that if something does go wrong, that contingency factor again, and it does impact upon business operations because it took longer than what was necessary, you need to be prepared for that cost to the business. The other element to look at is architecture. And I suppose a good point there is to make sure that your architecture, in particular in terms of network connectivity, and is ready for you to move into the cloud in your cost considerations. A good example is we had a client just recently. They're starting to move workloads up into Azure, which is great, but their routing infrastructure that they had on the edge of the network wasn't able to do route-based VPNs. So we needed to change the network infrastructure on the edge to allow those VPNs to work within their organization to go back into Azure. So again, there are other impacts on your infrastructure once you move to the cloud, and it's just taking them into consideration, in particular from a cost perspective. So operating considerations to have when you're running a cloud. Look, over provision versus under provisioning. We have the ability when we're using cloud-based services to thin provision and to bring some things up as we go along, as the load requires or as the storage need presents itself. When you're budgeting, make sure that you incorporate those growth models into your budget. So previously and historically, if we talked about this as physical infrastructure, we would say the asset life of this server is 3 to 5 years. We're going to build when we buy for that capacity that we need in that 3 to 5 year period, depending on what our asset life cycle is. So we would spend and get the biggest value for our dollar up front and then realize that down the track. Now with cloud, we can still realize that we're going to have that growth requirement, but build it into the budget. So that's going to be possibly an escalating cost as workload demands. Putting that in will make it a little bit easier for you when it comes to justifying your budget, and also make it easier when you start to analyze your budget against performance. Server sprawl. So this is the, we encountered this 2007, 2006, 2007, we started to really see this, I guess, with virtualization, where all of a sudden we had condensed all of these physical servers down into these virtualized farms, and people would spin up servers left, right, and center because they could. And then they got orphaned and left out. So this, in terms of back in that kind of architecture, didn't really have a major direct cost impact to the organization. Because a little bit of electricity usage, a little bit more cooling as the load come up on the physical servers, but generally that didn't have an impact. Now there's a real cost impact when you spin up a server in your cloud instance and you leave it running and it gets orphaned. If it's still running, it's ticking over every day, it's costing you money. So be prepared to be vigilant upon looking at not only after your budgeting, but when you're running through your budget cycle and you're analyzing your costs against your budget, looking at these things and going, why is there these 6 servers that are out there that we didn't know about before, and making sure that the business owners are aware. They need to turn them off if they're sort of periodical workloads that they need to use, or they can be decommissioned altogether. This will generally happen in test and dev environment as well, whether you're spinning a server up to test some form of application or develop it. Just to understand that you need to be vigilant around those costs. understand what your variable costs are when you're running your cloud. And the example there that we've got is storage. So storage is one of those things that is quite variable in cost in terms of tiering. So performance disk versus nearline on storage versus archival disk is quite a different cost base. So understanding the data that you're putting out onto your different storage layers and where it sits is important. You can budget that quite well. You can be paying extra money if you're sticking everything on performance disk that doesn't need to be there, and then you can take a performance hit if you want to save money and stick it on archive layer disk. Just make sure that you've got your data on the right workloads. And the beauty is that if you're budgeting that correctly and you analyze that down the track, you can actually shift these workloads onto different storage tiers as you need, by understanding that's something that you can take into consideration. The other one with storage, I guess, another variable cost is storage grows. It very rarely shrinks. So understand your growth requirement going forward. Again, looking at your historical data, you'll be able to see that you had an average of 1 terabyte growth over the last 2 years. So you can plan that out and smooth those costs increases out as you dial it up through your budget through the months and periods. But understand you don't need to spend it all out front. So that comes back down to a provisioning conversation. The third one with storage is what people often overlook, is as they move storage out into these cloud options for cloud storage in particular, ingress is generally free, egress normally costs. So understand what it costs to get your data outside of your cloud storage. And this sometimes is a bit of an educated guess because you don't really analyze that when that data pool sits inside your internal storage or your on-premise infrastructure. So you need to sort of have a look at what kind of data you've got and where that's moving out of your cloud infrastructure. Now, some providers will give you a cap that you get for free and then cost per gigabyte after that. Just understand those costs and build that into your budget consideration as well. And the other one to think about in terms of how you support once you move these workloads or these applications out into the cloud is how do your support skills and troubleshooting go with the cloud? There's a lot more, I suppose, network emphasis in terms of connectivity out to the cloud, but also if you've looked at the Azure portal, for example, it's not exactly intuitive. It's not too bad, but there's tick boxes in there that you can click that will have devastating effects on your infrastructure or your virtual infrastructure out in the cloud. So there may be new skills required by your team if you're internally supporting, or from your provider if they're not included in your contract. So generally a provider like an infrastructure support provider will go, look, we don't care where the servers sit. They can sit in Azure, AWS, your on-prem infrastructure, and our cloud. It doesn't really matter as long as we can support it, but make sure that's included in your support contract, because you may get some sticker shock that comes back when you move these workloads out into a provider and that's not covered by your current contract. We're just going to run another quick poll, I guess, and this one is just sort of to determine, if you've had any unexpected costs or contingency within your budget. Okay, excellent. Thanks for those responses, everyone. It sort of helps me to understand where everyone's sitting within their cycles. All right, so sourcing strategy, I guess, in terms of if people can just chat inside the box, I guess, whether they provide insourcing, whether there's outsourcing in their environment, or whether they multi-source. So insourcing is you're delivering all of these services internally. Outsourcing is whether you have a partial or a full outsource of any part of your infrastructure or the services to support that. And multi-sourcing is where you have multiple vendors, either internal or external, taking care of different elements of your infrastructure and your support. In the chat. Yeah. So if you just type that in the chat box, if you can give us an indication there, that'd be great. Okay. All right then. We'll keep moving on. So some of the challenges with insourcing. Sometimes it's only often the direct costs that are considered. And when we talk about direct costs for insourcing support, that's generally salary or the burden salary rate for their employees. So understanding that there are other costs that to be considered and to add those into your budget it's important. And so some of those that we have here is that normally you need to cover a skill or a knowledge gap to be included. So in general terms of an internal support team has a certain level of skill, and there's, they don't have much room for SMEs in particular technology verticals. So making sure that to fill that support gap that you have some kind of contingency in your budget, either that's for short-term contractor or some provider to come in and help you with that. Burst activity, general patterns of business activity that we see, sometimes seasonal workloads. Generally, most internal support teams have, you've got 10 people this month, you have 10 people next month, you have 10 people the month after. Sometimes it's difficult to dial up for unplanned heavy workloads. So understanding that you need to have contingency in your budget to address for those static support levels that you've got, again, either via a contractor or a vendor. Support versus projects, again, add contingency here for supplemental support. Generally from an internal team, the experience that I've had over the last 20 plus years is that projects are sexy, projects are the latest technology, projects are the things that people want to do, and BAU or business as usual activities will generally suffer because that's the more mundane and the more day-to-day operational stuff. So just understanding that if you have a heavy internal project delivery workload, that your BAU support will suffer unless you either supplement that project load with another resource or supplement your support load. The other thing is that in this fast-moving and quick-paced environment, particularly with IT, training and education is important for our delivery staff. So, direct costs that are borne are sometimes courses, exams that need to be done by people in terms of new technology grab, but also there's indirect costs, the time that they're away. If you've got a 10-person shop and you take one person away to do a course for 5 days, then the impact's not going to be that great. But if you have a 3-person shop and you take one guy away for a week, and that's going to have an impact on your operation. So just budgeting the costs inside your budget to account for those elements. Outsourcing, it's something that I could talk about all day and probably have done at times. Structure your contracts based on outcomes. So what does that mean? Look, move to fixed rate or device or user-based model. This helps to stabilize your cost predictability. And this has been a big trend in outsourcing for probably the last 6 or 7 years, moving to more stable and predictable cost models. If you're using support hours models or ticket-based unit models, you cannot predict the level of tickets that are going to be here on a help desk. And if you have a flag fall for each ticket that gets raised, you don't know from 1 month to the next what that cost base is going to be. Rolling that all up into, like I said, a fixed rate or a user device-based model helps to stabilize that cost predictability. You know when you're adding extra users into your environment. You know when you're adding another site. You know when you're adding more infrastructure, so you can budget that accordingly and with some predictability. So you know that it's X amount per device, X amount per user. Choose the right service level. This is very important. Aggressive service levels come with aggressive pricing. So the more aggressive you want your service level, the more expensive it's going to be. Make sure that that service level is relevant to your organization and not because you want the fastest outcome. Generally, if you look at the SLA and what you want, you can scale that back to get the right size for your organization and the right outcome, and then that will have a cost impact, generally in lowering the cost base if you can relax those SLAs a little bit. Sometimes SLA numbers get focused on too heavily, saying I want a 5-minute response and a 15-minute fix. That's very expensive to do that because the provider needs the cost and the ability to do that. So make sure you right size your SLA. Transition costs. This is very important. If you're transitioning from an in-source model to an outsource or from one vendor to another, there's a transition that needs to happen. Now, you will pay the vendor for that transition, but there's also, it's not a passive exercise, right? There are costs that will be borne internally for you to make sure that that goes right. If you have The example I give, I've done a transition with a software application support that happened. Vendor A and B in the room, the CIO comes in and goes, all right, vendor A, vendor B, welcome, you guys are transferring, you guys work it out, just give me updates as you go. And that will never end well, ever, because one company is leaving and another one is taking over service. So the company that's leaving wants to do as little as possible they can to reduce their cost to move out of the contract that they've lost. And then the company that's coming in has got a finite spend generally that they've allocated for this, so they don't want to work extra. So the balancing and the fixing of that relationship will be borne by you as a client, so make sure that you budget for that cost impact. And also internal process changes. There may be some changes to your internal operations as a result of outsourcing and working with a different provider. So just to understand that if there's any changes to those costs, the impact that those costs may have, and putting those into your budget. Multi-sourcing, so this is where multiple providers providing different delivery across different technology stacks. Look, managing the relationship, the overhead of managing the relationship with and between the vendors is very important. You need to understand that this, again, it's not passive, it's very active, and you'll get a lot of finger pointing between vendors if this isn't set up correctly. And then to set it up correctly, you need to attribute some cost to that, and that cost may be in the form of, it may be extra additional workload on an IT director to run that, or you may actually need to provide another FTE to actually run that vendor management function. The group that I manage, the VCIOs, this is a lot of what we do. So we feel this every day. So if you end up in a multi-sourcing environment, which is kind of common these days, and particularly in larger organizations, just bear in mind that there's a cost to manage that relationship. If you have multiple companies delivering, make sure there's no overlap in service responsibility. And this is generally done by two ways. One, having a tight scope, so making sure that the scope that you are delivering on each of these individual contracts is tight and defined, and that it doesn't overlap. And the other one is to form a RACI model to say, here are all the things I need to provide in my for my support of my environment. This is who's responsible for a contract vendor A, contract vendor B. There should never be two people that are there. With a loose scope, what you'll find is that the vendors will cost delivering that. Both of them will cost delivering it, but only one of them will actually be delivering it, and you'll be paying twice for the same service. Again, coming back to managing the relationships, there are productivity lags and efficiency declines with multiple vendors. There's handover points when a support ticket goes from one vendor to another will cause lag and have indirect cost implications. So make sure that the business is aware of that so they can build that into their budgets as well. And then reducing your vendor numbers. So, it makes sense to consolidate vendors where appropriate. You will get efficiencies of and economies of scale when you have combined service responsibilities to a single vendor. However, you need to balance this against your risk appetite. The reason why people multi-source is generally to spread the risk across vendors and, for want of a better word, not put all their eggs in one basket. So information security. This is an important sector, and we spoke about this previously, where businesses are leaning into spending more money in their budgets around information security. So, as the slide here predicts, on average, cybersecurity has been the most increased budget item over the last 3 years. So, okay, yeah, okay. So, in 2015. The average cost of a stolen record was $217. So what does that mean? If you have a cybersecurity breach and you lose, or you have a stolen or compromised record, that has a direct cost impact to, one, taking care of the event that's happened, communicating out to your client base, making sure that you rectify that. So the average cost to deal with that event was $217 per record. So we use the example, a small health club with 450 customer records, that's a $97,000 exercise in actual cost. Now, that's the incident cost. You then need to look at the ongoing impact that has to an organization. So in the survey, again, 32% of 32% of customers that were affected left that company. That small health club now with 450 customer records now has 350 actually 300 active customers. So they've automatically just cut their revenues by a third by having a security breach, let alone the reputation impact that it has later going on. Also, the other cost associated here is that 31% of organizations impacted had 8 hours of downtime for the entire organization. So the soft cost lost there, again, our loss in productivity, is another ongoing impact of the security breach. So you can see that these costs add up very quickly, and it's why people are starting to change their penchant for investing in their budgets and in their infrastructure in IT security. Now, 70% of businesses, as you see the slide on the little infographic on the bottom left, so they spend 5% of their IT budgets on security. So that's not a bad number, but the ones that lean forward, the ones that have got a strong security posture, they spend on average 13.6%. Now, we've spoken about this in the past to customers, and I run a lunch and learn yesterday. We covered this as well. If you don't know what to do with that money, at least allocate it and then get someone to come in and help you. Surround yourself with people who know what they're talking about, and we're finding this is one of our biggest growth areas inside Dataprise as well. So at least allocate the money, and then what you can do with that money over time, over year 1, 2, 3 of your budget. But if you don't allocate that money and you leave it as you go, then what you're going to find is you're going to end up in, like the small health club, you're going to end up spending a lot of money to deal with a problem that you could have probably prevented earlier. So just just one thing to keep in mind, these are some of the hidden costs that don't exist inside your budget. If it's not inside your budget now, look at how you can get it in there. So we're getting close to the end here. So there's a few things, I guess, in terms of vendor cost management to help you guys. Longer term contracts, you need to smooth these cost burdens out. So aside from just having elements inside of your budget, one of the challenges that you really have is also making sure that you keep some cost control across the length of your budget in terms of cash flow management. So, CFOs hate it when all the bills land at the same time. So what we need to do is, if we've got like in multi-source environments, if you've got vendor A, B, and C delivering different stacks, stagger those contract negotiations and retendering and reevaluating in different, I guess, budget periods. And I'm talking about fiscal year 1, fiscal year 2, and fiscal year 3. Just making sure that they all don't land at the same time in terms of the big cost burdens. The other one to do is look at co-terming your maintenance. We see this a lot where, as an environment has grown over time, we've had to add extra endpoint security licenses. So say you're licensing with Symantec, if that's your vendor, you have a bill that comes in May, you have one that comes in June, July, and so forth. You don't want to be raising 10 purchase orders for the same product spread across the year. So try and co-term them all to land in one period. So co-term them all for May, for example. Now, I guess the smoothing that I talked about earlier also applies there. Don't have your Symantec licensing, your VMware licensing, your Microsoft licensing all land in the same month. That kind of defeats the purpose. But get all your vendors to be spread across your budget year, but all of their bills to sort of land in one area. So you're raising one PO, you're giving them one payment, and it makes it a lot easier for you to manage. Benchmark your costs. You set up a relationship with a vendor, say 5 years ago, so the pricing that you established with VMware 5 years ago, they gave you a 10% discount. The relationships changed a little bit. You've got a larger volume. I guess the hypervisor and virtualization market is changing as well. So you've got someone like Hyper-V with Microsoft coming and leaning into their market space. So re-talk to them and reset that. You may be spending money that you don't need to, but because you can get a better deal just because you've been dealing with them for a long time. And while doing that, I guess you do the cost comparison, right? You take the competitor looking for the same functionality, and that's important. You do an apple-for-apple comparison. And if you have the same functionality from a Cisco ASA versus a Sonic Wall firewall, for example, you may want to look at what it's going to take to change vendors if you're going to get a cost comparison. Often, okay, you're playing the vendors off against one another a little bit, but it's to say you may be able to get a better price out of Cisco. If not, you need it if you're going to change the firewall. Also think of the changeover cost, like what's it going to cost to change those technologies, because there may be some differences that you need to work out. But again, don't get complacent in your vendor. They generally leads to having inflated costs, so be vigilant. Also, set your cadence for your commercial reviews in longer term agreements. If you have a 5-year agreement with a vendor, 5 years is a long time. It's a long time in IT, but it's a long time in general. So make sure that you have the right cadence set for your review. You may want to review that contract on an annual basis. You may want to review it on a 6-monthly basis. So just make sure that you don't do your contract review at the end of the term. If you've done a 5-year contract and you're reviewing it at the end of the term, you probably left a lot of money on the table that you could have saved because your environment's changed or your situations have differed. So again, we're getting towards the end here. So this is more around, we talked about the budget process and assembling your budget before. This is the budget cycle. So again, it's continually going, right? You prepare your budget, you approve it, you execute it, and then you evaluate it. So you're always looking to do that. So prepare early. Again, don't budget in a bubble. Engage your key business stakeholders and understand where the business is going, because it will impact your budget. You need to support the business. So if they're going out and doing this, this wild adventure into another business line, you need to be prepared and ready to support that. Again, along that line, history can help. It can give you trends. It can give you what has happened, but understand what your future state looks like. Again, if your business is going out and they're going to acquire another organization, this is going to have some significant impacts upon IT. You need to understand what they are, and you need to be able to budget accordingly. Longer term costs, we'll talk about multi-cycle stuff over in the next slide, but look at your long-term commitments. 3-year licensing and maintenance deals, for example, sometimes the discount that you get may not offer you the flexibility that you want. And I give a good example of this in 2007. I had a client that went into a $2.5 million lease deal with some infrastructure. It's great. They needed the infrastructure. The workload was fantastic. So end of 2007, 2008, there's a little thing called the GFC that occurred, and their business downsized 40%. Which was, they had a lot of cost base that way saving, but they had locked into a lease deal on this equipment for the next 2.5 years. So 40%, well, actually it was a bit more. It was about 50% of the infrastructure that they were paying a lease on was sitting dormant in their data center, not doing anything. So, could we have predicted the GFC? Probably not, but it didn't give them the flexibility. So sometimes committing to that long-term engagement, the discount offered may be detrimental if it doesn't give you the flexibility to either reject if things change or modify the agreement. The other thing is to look at is what lands in this year's budget that didn't last year or the year before, for example. So again, these 3-year decisions or 5-year decisions that are made, particularly in capital acquisition costs, you're going to look at that and go, well, it didn't land last year, and then all of a sudden you have to renew a lease, or you have to change your licensing agreement because you're at your 3-year. So just understand what it is that doesn't land in the budget and account for that. And the other thing, I guess, in terms of budget cycle is split longer-term projects into manageable slices, get them to land in the years and the fiscal years that you need to, which is the segue to the next slide, which is multi-year commitment. If you generally set your budget for 1 year, you need to understand long-term decision impacts and what they are into future fiscal years or future budget cycles. If you enter into again, an example is that you enter a 2 or 3 year project, make some milestone payments. Split the project up so that, yes, you are committing to a $3 million deal, but you only need to spend $750 in this year. There's $1 million in the year after, and there's a $750 in the closing year. Just understand where that is and make sure the business is aware that, yeah, we're committing to this deal, but this is how it's going to break out and how it's going to impact the company. The other thing is that when the funding is uncertain or when the outcome is, not quite clear, you can break a project into certain, I guess, shorter independent phases. So we take the example of implementing a new CRM, functionality that you need, that core functionality, that's phase 1, you can break that out. Now that's independent of phase 2, which is additional functionality, which could be a want or something that you could delete or delay later on. So making sure that you take into account where things are not dependent to break them out separately into phases, and sometimes even set them into different commercial arrangements. So I'm going to get you to come and deliver, pay for phase one, and then move out across, and phase two will be optional if we go forward. And finally, the last slide, so thank you all for staying with us. Shift business unit initiatives, if you can, when you're given a cost-cutting directive, into their budgets. Often they slide in by stealth into IT budgets, and the support of that application and the delivery of that application or the building of that project may very well be totally borne by that other business unit. So make sure that you're not paying for other business units' directives or their ideas or initiatives, and move that out if it sits there. And then it becomes, the cost cutting is easy for you. You just cut your budget, but also then they have to work out how they're going to cut their costs. Discretionary items should be negotiable. We talked about these before. These are the bits in your budget that you can delay or delete. So, but get the business to set that priority again. These are things that will affect your budget. And if it's an initiative that is solely IT, then you have discretionary spending around that. But if it's discretionary spending that is based on a project that's getting delivered for another business unit, make sure that that's understood. Communicate the impact of non-discretionary items. Sometimes that directive to cut costs, and then cut some more, you end up impacting those things that you think you need to support and survive. So again, I use an example to quantify this. If something takes 100 hours worth of effort, it takes 100 hours worth of effort. It doesn't matter how you slice that. So if you want to change that cost base to be 80 hours worth of effort, something in that is going to drop off, and it's generally quality or a deliverable. So if it's a project, the first thing that gets sliced out is documentation. It's the worst thing to slice out, but it's the easiest one to cut out. If it's in terms of ongoing support, just understand there will be impacts. If you need to take your 10-man shop and cutting costs means making that a 9-man shop, you still have the same workload that you had before. So make sure that you can communicate that up into the business, what the cost impacts are. And maybe you may be able to convince them that you don't need to cut that cost. And the other one is, I guess, is understand the drivers for the cost cutting. What are they coming for? Is it to increase the bottom line? Generally that's the cost, or we're feeling cost pressures from our vendors, so we need to push that on. Costs may be able to be maintained if you can increase the value. So maybe by demonstrating why that cost sits inside your budget and the value that it adds, again, justification for the cost, but also the value that it delivers into the business, you may be able to keep that in your budget. Again, it's all negotiable. If you take it from the business that they send it directed down to cut costs by 20%, you may be able to get away with 15 if you can justify your budget. They may put pressure on another department, and I guess conversely, if you can't justify it, someone else in the business may be able to. You may have to change that 20 to 25. Again, so again, that's the last slide. I'm always available here if you've got any questions and you want to contact me. You've got my name and details. Again, thank you for attending the webinar. I hope to talk to you guys soon again on another webinar.